My name is Alistair Finch. It is with a measure of trepidation, yet an undeniable compulsion, that I commit these memories to writing. For decades, they have resided in the shadowed recesses of my mind, a collection of chilling narratives gifted to me by my paternal grandmother, Elara Finch. Most were fleeting frights, the kind that make a child wary of the dark for a night or two before fading into the general tapestry of youthful anxieties. But there was one story, one particular account, that burrowed deeper. It became an unwelcome lodger in my psyche, its tendrils entwined with the very roots of my perception. Even now, as a man who prides himself on logic and composure, the recollection of it, and the unsettling echoes it cast upon my life, can send a shiver down my spine that has nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The decision to document this is not born of a desire for notoriety, nor is it an attempt to unburden myself in any conventional therapeutic sense. Rather, it feels like a duty, a final, perhaps futile, attempt to delineate the boundaries between a story and the insidious way it can seep into the cracks of one's reality. The formality with which I approach this task is, I confess, a carefully constructed dam against the flood of unease that threatens to overwhelm me whenever I dwell too long on those formative years spent in grandmother Elara's company. It is a shield, however flimsy, against the creeping notion that some stories are more than just words. Grandmother Elara was not the archetypal purveyor of comforting bedtime tales. There were no benevolent fairies or valiant knights in her repertoire. Her domain was the twilight realm, the spaces between the known and the feared. She was a tall woman, gaunt even in her middle years, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, often holding a glint that was more unsettling than amusing. Her voice, usually a low, measured timbre drop, to a conspirial whisper when she reached the crux of a tale, drawing you in, making you lean closer, despite every instinct screaming for you to recoil. She had a way of looking at you, a penetrating gaze that seemed to suggest she knew the hidden fears you harbored, the ones you barely acknowledged yourself. Her house stood as a testament to her narratives. It was an old Victorian structure, on the outskirts of a town that had long seen better days. Set back from a seldom used road and prepped in the shadows of overgrown, ancient oaks. The paint peeled from its clapboard siding like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged with a weary sigh. Inside, the air was always cool, tinged with the scent of dust, dried herbs, and something else, something indefinably old and still. Floors creaked with the gravitas of secrets, and the wind, as it snaked through the ill-fitting window frames, seemed to carry whispers from forgotten times. It was the perfect stage for her stories, a place where the mundane felt thin, and the extraordinary, terrifyingly plausible. I often wondered, even as a child, about the source of her tales. Were they products of a morbidly vivid imagination, or did she have some deeper, more unsettling connection to the folklore she so expertly wove? She never said. Her stories were presented as simple truths, accounts of things that had happened, or could happen, if one wasn't careful, if one strayed too far from the light. Her repertoire was extensive, a chilling library of local legends and more personal, familial hauntings. I recall one particularly: bleak winter's evening, the wind howling a mournful dirge outside, when she told me of the fen walker. This was a creature, she said, that haunted the marshlands beyond our town, a gaunt, shadowy figure seen only at dusk, its feet never quite touching the sodden earth. It didn't chase or attack, not directly. It simply appeared, a silent sentinel at the edge of your vision, and those who saw it were said to slowly lose their way, not just in the physical sense, but in their minds, their memories becoming as muddled and treacherous as the bog itself. She described its eyes, or rather the lack of them, just deeper patches of shadow in its indistinct face, and how looking upon it felt like gazing into an abyss that threatened to swallow your thoughts. That night, every shadow in my small attic bedroom seemed to elongate, to take on a vaguely humanoid form, and the familiar patterns of the wallpaper twisted into grotesque, watching faces. Sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. Another time, during a stifling summer afternoon, when the air was thick and heavy with unspoken things, she spoke of the borrowed voice. This wasn't a creature, but a phenomenon. Sometimes, she explained, when you were alone in an old house, truly alone, you might hear a familiar voice call your name, your mother, your father, a sibling. But if you answered, if you called back into the silence, you invited something in. Something that had been listening, learning, waiting to mimic the sounds of safety, to lure you into its grasp. She told of a distant cousin who, as a child, had heard his deceased mother calling him from the cellar. He had answered, and though he was found unharmed, he was never quite the same. He became withdrawn, fearful of familiar sounds, and would often stare at his own family members, as if they were strangers wearing ill-fitting masks. These stories, and others like them, chipped away at my childish sense of security. The world, under Grandmother Elara's tutelage, became a place far more menacing than I had previously understood. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a veil behind which unseen things stirred. Silence was not peace, but a listening void. The ordinary, the trusted, could at any moment reveal an unsettling, alien core. My nights were often punctuated by jolts of fear, my imagination painting monsters in the familiar gloom of my room, my ears straining for any sound that was out of place. I learned to dread the fall of dusk when her telling sessions would typically commence, usually in her high backed armchair by the sputtering fireplace, the flickering light casting her features into a stark, almost predatory relief. Yet, for all the terror these tales induced, there was an undeniable pull, a morbid fascination that kept me returning to her side, hungry for the next chilling installment. It was a strange inheritance she was bestowing upon me, this legacy of fear, one that I both craved and loathed. But among all her narratives, all the specters and strange occurrences she catalogued with such unnerving calm, there was one that was different. She seldom told it. In fact, for many years, I only knew of its existence through oblique references. A certain shadowed tone in her voice, if a conversation veered too close to its periphery. It was her masterpiece of dread, the one story that, even in its unspoken presence, seemed to cast a longer, colder shadow than all the others combined. I sensed it was the heart of her own private darkness, a tale she perhaps wished she could forget, but was compelled to keep alive. I remember asking for it once, emboldened by a rare surge of youthful bravado. Her reaction was uncharacteristic. The usual glint in her eye vanished, replaced by something akin to genuine disquiet. She simply shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line and changed the subject with an abruptness that brooked no argument. This, of course, only amplified its mystique, its forbidden allure. It became, in my young mind, the ultimate horror, the secret she guarded most closely. What was it about this particular story that set it apart? What made it so potent, so seemingly dangerous in her estimation? I wouldn't find out for several more years. Not until a night when the very elements seemed to conspire to draw it from her. A night when the world outside her creaking house mirrored the tempest she was about to unleash within my soul. The anticipation of it, even now, is a cold knot in my stomach. For that was the night she finally told me the one story I would never, ever forget. And that is where the true darkness began to take root. The night grandmother Elara finally relented, the world outside her ancient house seemed to hold its breath. It was late autumn. The kind of evening where the chill seeped not just into your bones, but into your thoughts, making them brittle. There was no dramatic storm, no howling wind to serve as a theatrical overture. Instead, a profound stillness had fallen, a silence so complete it felt like the prelude to something momentous, or perhaps something dreadful. The only sounds were the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound I usually found comforting, but which that night seemed to be counting down to an unknown revelation, and the occasional crackle from the fireplace, where embers glowed like watchful eyes in the dim room. I was older then, perhaps 10 or 11, old enough to feel a more complex blend of fear and fascination, old enough to understand that some stories carried a weight that went beyond simple scares. We were in her usual spot, she in her high back chair, me on the worn rug at her feet. I hadn't asked for the story. I hadn't dared to. Not since her previous, curt refusal. But the atmosphere in the room, thick with unspoken things, and a certain distant, haunted look in her eyes, told me that tonight was different. She had been quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, her gnarled fingers laced together in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, almost a whisper. Yet it filled the oppressive silence of the room with an unnerving clarity. There are things in this world, Alistair, she began, her gaze still fixed on the fire, that are best left undisturbed, unacknowledged. Things that exist in the spaces we try to ignore, in the shadows of our own making. She paused, and I felt a familiar prickle of unease, the precursor to her more potent tales. But this felt different. There was no theatricality in her tone, no glint of dark amusement in her eyes when she finally turned them towards me. There was only a profound wariness. And something else. A flicker of what I can only describe as old, settled fear. This isn't like the Fenwalker, or the whispers in an empty house. She continued, her voice raspy. Those are echoes, remnants. This is about something that takes, something that replaces. My heart began to thud a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty, that chilled me to the core, that she was about to unveil the story I had both craved and dreaded. It happened a long time ago, she said. In a village not so different from the ones you see now, nestled deep in the folds of the countryside, where the old ways still held sway, and the modern world was just a distant rumor. A place where people knew their neighbors, their histories, their secrets. She described this village, painting a picture of quaint cottages with thatched roofs, a winding cobblestone street, a small, ancient church with a leaning spire, all surrounded by dense, whispering woods and rolling fields that seemed to stretch into an eternity of green and gold. It sounded idyllic, a picture book sort of place. But as she spoke, her words began to subtly taint the image, like a drop of ink spreading in clear water. They were a close, knit community, she said. But even in such places, things can go unnoticed. Small changes at first, so small, you doubt your own senses, before you doubt the person before you. Her story centered on a family, a farmer, his wife, and their 2 young children. A good family, respected, ordinary. The trouble began, she said, with the farmer, a man named Thomas. He'd gone into the woods one evening to retrieve a stray sheep, a common enough task. He was gone longer than expected, returning well after dusk, looking tired and a little disheveled, but otherwise himself. Or so it seemed. His wife, Mary, Grandmother Alara continued, her voice barely above a breath, was the first to feel it. A subtle offness. The way he looked at her, sometimes, as if he were trying to remember who she was, or perhaps how he was supposed to look at her. He'd forget small things, a promise made, a shared memory. He'd misplace tools he'd used his entire life. Little things. Things easily dismissed. I leaned closer, captivated, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her face, making her features seem to shift and change, her eyes like dark pools reflecting the flickering flames. Then, she said, her voice dropping further, the children started to notice. Their father, who had always been quick with a laugh or a story, became quiet. Not a sad quiet, or an angry quiet, just an empty quiet. He would sit by the fire for hours, staring, not really seeing. His movements became a little too deliberate, his smile a little too fixed, never quite reaching his eyes. Grandmother Ellara described how Mary, consumed by a growing, nameless dread, tried to talk to him, to reach him, but her words seemed to slide off him, unheeded. He would respond, yes, but his responses were echoes. Parroted phrases, sentiments that felt learned rather than felt. He was there, but he was not. The villagers began to whisper, she said. They saw Thomas in the fields, working with his usual diligence, but there was a lack of life in his movements. His eyes, they said, were like a doll's eyes, vacant, staring. He still looked like Thomas. He still sounded, mostly, like Thomas. But the Thomas they knew was hollowed out. This was the term she used, and it sent a particular chill through me. The hollowed man. She explained that this thing, this presence, didn't kill. It didn't leave a body. It emptied and occupied. It wore people like a suit of clothes, learning to mimic them, but always imperfectly. The horror wasn't in a sudden, violent attack, but in the slow, creeping realization that the person you knew, the person you loved, was being erased from within, replaced by something that looked like them, but was utterly, terrifyingly alien. Mary lived with this version of her husband for months. Grandmother Alara's voice was strained. Imagine, child, waking up next to it, eating across the table from it, hearing it use your husband's voice to speak, but knowing, deep in your soul, that it wasn't him. The children grew fearful, avoiding him. The dog, once his constant companion, would whine and slink away whenever he approached. The true terror of the story, as my grandmother related, was in this insidious replacement. There was no monster to fight, no clear enemy to confront. Just the slow, agonizing erosion of a loved one, and the dawning horror of what was taking their place. It was a psychological torment, a living nightmare where reality itself became suspect. One day, she said, her eyes locking onto mine, holding me captive, Mary found Thomas, or what looked like Thomas, standing in front of a mirror. He wasn't looking at his reflection. He was studying it, intently, like an actor learning a role. His head was tilted, his expression one of intense concentration, as if he were trying to perfect the minute details of being Thomas. And then he smiled. But the smile was wrong. It was too wide. The eyes remained cold, and, for a fleeting second, she saw something flicker. Behind those eyes, something ancient, and empty, and utterly inhuman. I could almost see it, the quiet room, the man at the mirror, the horrifyingly wrong smile. My own reflection in the darkened window pane seemed to waver. Mary finally broke. Grandmother Alara said. She couldn't bear it any longer. She took the children and fled the village in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. She never looked back. No one knows what became of the thing wearing Thomas's skin. Some say it eventually, tired of the charade, and simply walked away. Back into the woods, perhaps to find another vessel. Others say it still lives in that old farmhouse, a perfect, empty replica of a man who once was waiting. She paused, the silence in the room pressing in on me. The story didn't have a neat ending, no vanquishing of the evil, no restoration of what was lost, just a lingering, awful uncertainty. The hollowed man, she whispered, the name itself seeming to carry a chill. It doesn't want your life, Alistair. It wants your you. It empties you out, bit by bit, memory by memory, feeling by feeling, until all that's left is a shell for it to inhabit. And the worst part is, sometimes, those closest to the hollowed man, they start to forget what the real person was like. The imitation, however flawed, becomes the new reality. The true person is not just replaced, but erased from memory itself. She fell silent then, The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was colder. I sat there, frozen, the story coiling in my stomach like a cold serpent. It wasn't the goriest story she had ever told, nor the one with the most dramatic scares. But it was, by far, the most profoundly disturbing. The idea of being slowly erased, replaced by a hollow imitation of your loved ones not even realizing, or worse, slowly forgetting you. It touched a primal fear I hadn't known I possessed. Unlike her other stories, which often left me with a jumpy, immediate fear of the dark or strange noises, this one settled deeper. It wasn't about what might be lurking outside, but what might be happening inside someone, or even, terrifyingly, inside oneself. The thought was a cold sliver of ice in my mind. Grandmother Alara finally stirred, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at me, though the wariness remained. "It's just a story, Alistair," she said, her voice regaining some of its usual timbre. But there was no conviction in her words. We both knew in that moment that it felt like much more than that. That night, sleep was impossible. Every familiar shadow in my room seemed to hold a new, more subtle menace. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened glass of my window, and for a terrifying instant, wondered if my smile was quite right, if my eyes looked back at me with my own thoughts. The tale of the hollowed man had not just been heard, it had been absorbed. It had found a place within me, a dark seed planted in the fertile soil of my young imagination, and I had a dreadful premonition that it was there to stay, to grow. The true inheritance of fear had just begun to reveal its depth. The days immediately following Grandmother Alara's telling of the hollowed man were lived under a subtle, pervasive pall. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror of her other tales, the kind that made me jump at sudden noises or peer nervously into darkened corners. This was different. This was a quiet, gnawing unease that settled in the pit of my stomach and tinted my perception of everything and everyone around me. The world, which had once felt solid and predictable, now seemed to possess a disconcerting fragility, as if its familiar facade could at any moment crack to reveal something unsettling beneath. I found myself observing people with an intensity that was new and disturbing to me. Not just strangers, but my parents, my school teachers, even my friends. I'd watch their expressions, their gestures, the way their eyes met mine, searching for what I didn't quite know. A flicker of vacancy, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a moment of hesitation that seemed too long, a response that felt slightly rehearsed. The story had armed me with a terrible new vocabulary of suspicion. Every minor inconsistency, every forgotten name or misplaced object, every slightly off moment that I would have previously dismissed without a second thought, now snagged in my mind. A potential clue, a whisper of the hollowed man. My own reflection became a source of anxiety. I'd catch myself in mirrors, in shop windows, in the dark screen of the television, and a cold dread would wash over me. Was that truly me looking back? Or was it a clever imitation, already beginning its insidious work? I'd force a smile, then scrutinize it. Did it look genuine? Or was it, like the hollowed man's, a little too wide, a little too fixed. I'd try to recall specific memories, testing myself. A desperate attempt to anchor my sense of self, to prove I was still me. The fear of being hollowed out, of my own essence being slowly siphoned away and replaced, became a quiet torment. Grandmother Alara never mentioned the story again. In the days that followed, she reverted to her usual repertoire of less exciting, surely terrifying goals and local legends. But her silence on the hollowed man was, in its own way, more unsettling than if she had discussed it further. It was as if she had unlocked a forbidden door and then simply walked away, leaving me to contend with whatever had slithered out. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with that strange, knowing expression of hers, and I'd wonder if she saw the story's shadow clinging to me, if she knew the depth of the disquiet she had instilled. Her house, already a place of shadows and secrets, now felt even more charged, as if the very walls were listening, aware of the seed of dread she had planted. I remember one particular incident a few weeks after she told the tale. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon, and I was walking home from school, my head down, lost in the usual churn of hollowed man anxieties. A man was walking towards me on the otherwise empty pavement. He was unremarkable, middle-aged, dressed in a drab raincoat, carrying a worn briefcase. As he drew nearer, he looked up, and his eyes met mine. For a fleeting moment, his expression was utterly blank, his eyes like polished stones, reflecting nothing. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, a smile spread across his face, a wide, amiable, perfectly normal smile. He nodded a polite greeting and walked past. It was nothing. A momentary lapse in expression, perhaps. He was probably lost in thought, his face slackening before he registered my presence. That's what logic told me. But the image of that brief, terrifying blankness, that momentary absence Hood, seared itself into my memory. It was the hollowed man's vacant stare, the look Mary had seen in Thomas before the ill-fitting mask of his personality had been reapplied. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I broke into a run, not stopping, until I reached the relative safety of my own home. The image of the man's empty eyes burning behind my eyelids. Was he one of them? Or was my imagination, supercharged by my grandmother's tale, simply painting monsters onto ordinary people? I had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was a torment in itself. This became the pattern of my young life. The acute fear gradually subsided, but it left behind a residue, a chronic, low-level suspicion of the world. I became quieter, more observant, more prone to introspection. The easy, unthinking trust of childhood had been irrevocably fractured. I learned to navigate social interactions with a certain guardedness, always a part of me standing back, analyzing, searching for the subtle tells, the cracks in the performance. It was an exhausting way to live, and it isolated me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. The story of the hollowed man didn't just teach me to fear a specific entity. It taught me to fear the potential for emptiness, for imitation within the familiar. It suggested that the people we knew and loved could be shells, their true selves eroded and replaced by something that only wore their likeness. This concept, far more than any feigned monster or spectral apparition, was what truly haunted me. It was a deeply personal horror, one that attacked the very foundations of identity and relationship. As I grew older, moving into adolescence, the fear became less a conscious preoccupation and more an undercurrent, a permanent filter through which I viewed the world. It manifested as a kind of existential wariness, a difficulty in forming deep connections, a persistent feeling of being an outsider looking in. The world often felt like a stage, and people, actors playing their parts with varying degrees of skill. And always, in the periphery of my awareness, lurked the shadow of the hollowed man, a silent reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that the self could be stolen, that the familiar could be a carefully constructed lie. Grandmother Alara passed away when I was in my late teens. I attended her funeral, stood by her graveside in the old, windswept cemetery, and felt a complex mixture of grief, relief, and a lingering, unshakable dread. With her went her stories, her chilling voice, her knowing eyes. But the story of the hollowed man, her final, most potent gift, remained. It was embedded too deeply, its roots too thoroughly entwined with my own. It had become a part of me, a dark lens shaping my perception, a constant, quiet whisper in the back of my mind, questioning the authenticity of everything and everyone I encountered. The inheritance of fear was complete, and its terms were lifelong. The shadow in the periphery was not just an external observation. It was a reflection of an internal landscape, forever altered by a story told on a still, autumn night. Years unfurled, as they are wont to do, carrying me from adolescence into the ostensibly more rational realm of adulthood. I pursued a career in archival research, a profession that, in retrospect, seems almost a perverse irony. My days were spent sifting through the detritus of other people's lives, piecing together narratives from faded letters, brittle photographs, and forgotten documents. It was a quiet, solitary existence, one that suited the man the hollowed man's story had made of me observant, meticulous, and perpetually at a slight remove from the vibrant, messy business of living. The acute paranoia of my youth had dulled, or so I told myself, transforming into a kind of ingrained cynicism, a habit of looking for the subtext, the discrepancy, the crack in the veneer of everyday life. The hollowed man was no longer a constant specter at my shoulder, but rather a silent, unacknowledged lens through which I viewed the world. It was in this carefully curated solitude that I met Arthur. He was a fellow researcher, assigned to a project adjacent to mine in the hushed halls of the city archive. Arthur was, in many ways, my antithesis. Where I was reserved, he was effusive. Where I was analytical, he was intuitive. He possessed an easy charm, a quick laugh, and a way of speaking about his passions, obscure historical figures, the migration patterns of forgotten tribes, the evolution of cartography that was genuinely infectious. For the first time in many years, I found myself lowering my guard, drawn to his warmth and the uncomplicated way he seemed to inhabit his own skin. We developed a friendship, then something more. It was a slow, cautious unfolding on my part. But Arthur was patient, his presence a steady, reassuring light in the carefully managed twilight of my existence. For a time, the shadow of the hollowed man seemed to recede entirely. With Arthur, the world felt real, solid. His laughter was genuine. His anger, when it occasionally flared over some bureaucratic inefficiency, was authentic. His memories of his own past, which he shared freely, were detailed and consistent. I allowed myself to believe that the story was finally just that, a story. A dark fable from a childhood, steeped in my grandmother's unsettling narratives. The first tremor occurred on a Tuesday. It was insignificant, a detail so minor that anyone else would have dismissed it instantly. We were discussing a film we had both seen the previous weekend. I mentioned a particular scene, one that had resonated with me. Arthur frowned, a slight, almost imperceptible furrowing of his brow. "I don't recall that part," he said, his voice tinged with a faint note of confusion. I described it again, adding more detail. He shook his head, a small, dismissive gesture. "No, I'm quite sure that wasn't in the version we saw. It was a small thing." Perhaps he had been distracted during that part of the film. Perhaps my memory was faulty. But a cold tendril of unease, horribly familiar, snaked its way into my chest. It was the way he'd said it, the certainty in his tone, coupled with that fleeting look of blankness before his usual amiable expression had clicked back into place. It reminded me, with a sickening lurch, of Grandmother Elara's description of Thomas, the farmer, forgetting small, shared things. I tried to dismiss it. I did dismiss it outwardly. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to germinate in the fertile ground of my old fears. I started to watch Arthur more closely. A resurgence of my childhood vigilance that I had thought long dormant. I told myself it was absurd, a product of an overactive imagination, conditioned by years of morbid introspection. Yet I couldn't stop. Other inconsistencies followed, small at first, then more pronounced. He'd forget an anecdote he'd told me only weeks before, then recount it, later as if it were entirely new, sometimes with subtle but significant details altered. He'd misremember the names of places we'd visited together, or the sequence of events on a shared holiday. When I gently pointed these discrepancies out, he would either brush them off with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, or look at me with a flicker of that same unnerving blankness, followed by a carefully constructed expression of mild bewilderment. His physical presence, too, began to feel subtly different. It was nothing I could pinpoint, nothing tangible. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, his posture would seem a little too stiff, his movements a fraction too deliberate, as if he were consciously piloting a body that was not entirely his own. His smile, once so open and spontaneous, occasionally seemed to linger a moment too long, becoming a rictus that felt more like a mimicry of warmth than the genuine article. The most disturbing change was in his eyes. Arthur had always had expressive eyes, full of light and intelligence. But increasingly, I would catch moments when they seemed vacant. Not merely unfocused, but empty. like windows into a room where the lights had been extinguished. It would last only a second or two. However, a fleeting glimpse into an unnerving stillness before the familiar spark returned, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. I began to document these instances in a small journal, my handwriting growing increasingly agitated. The act of writing them down felt like a desperate attempt to impose order on a reality that was beginning to fray at the edges. Was Arthur ill? Was he under some immense stress he wasn't sharing? Or was something far more sinister? Something straight from the pages of my grandmother's most terrifying tale, unfolding before my very eyes. The memory of Mary, Thomas's wife, haunted me. Her dawning horror, her isolation, the slow, agonizing realization that the man she loved was being erased from within. Was I now Mary? Was Arthur becoming hollowed? The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary evening. We were at home, a quiet dinner. I was recounting a memory from my childhood, a trivial but specific event involving grandmother Alara and one of her less terrifying stories. Arthur listened, his head tilted, an expression of polite interest on his face. When I finished, he smiled that slightly too wide, slightly too fixed smile that had become increasingly common. "That's a charming story, Alistair," he said, his voice smooth, perfectly modulated. "But you told it to me last month, remember? By the old oak tree in Regent's Park." A cold shock coursed through me. I had never told him that story before. I was certain of it. And we had never been to Regent's Park together and discussed such things by an oak tree. The details were specific, yet utterly, demonstrably false. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I've never told you this before. And we haven't been to Regent's Park in months. And certainly not to discuss my grandmother." He looked at me, and for a horrifying, protracted moment, his face was a complete blank. The smile vanished, the light in his eyes extinguished. There was nothing there. Just a smooth, empty canvas where Arthur should have been. Then, slowly, painstakingly, an expression of gentle concern assembled itself on his features. "Alistair," he said, his voice soft, pitying. "Are you feeling all right? You seem forgetful lately." Grandmother Alara's words echoed in my mind. And the worst part is, sometimes, those closest to the hollowed man, they start to forget what the real person was like. The imitation, however flawed, becomes the new reality. The true person is not just replaced, but erased from memory itself. Why? Is it happening to me? Was I the one whose memory was failing? Was this thing, this hollowed man, not only replacing Arthur, but also rewriting my own past, making me doubt my sanity, my own perceptions? The story was no longer just a story. It was an active, malevolent force, unmaking my world, unmaking me. I don't know what happened to Arthur, or the thing that wore his face. One morning, he was simply gone. No note, no explanation. His belongings were still in place, as if he had merely stepped out for a moment. But he never returned. The authorities found no trace. It was as if he had evaporated. Or perhaps as if the imitation, having served its purpose, or perhaps having become too flawed, had simply been withdrawn. I am alone now, more alone than ever before. The archive, once a place of quiet refuge, now feels like a mausoleum of forgotten selves. I look at the faces of strangers on the street, at my colleagues, even at my own reflection, and the question always burns. Is it you? Or is it the hollowed man, looking back with eyes that are not its own? The story my grandmother told me has consumed my life. Or perhaps, it has given my life its only true, terrible meaning. I write this now, not as a warning, for what good are warnings against such an insidious threat? I write this because I must. Because the act of telling, of recording, is the only thing that assures me that I, Alastair Finch, still exist. But even as I write these words, a cold thought takes root. What if this account is not my own? What if the hollowed man is not a creature that replaces others, but a story that replaces its tellers, hollowing them out and filling them with its own narrative, ensuring its own survival through an endless succession of haunted voices? What if I am merely its latest vessel? My memories, my fears, my very identity, nothing more than the latest, meticulously crafted performance. The pen feels heavy in my hand. The words on the page seem to stare back at me, alien and unfamiliar. The reflection in the darkened window, it smiles. But the smile doesn't quite reach its eyes.